bit of background on Keeping Faith in Rabbis, a community conversation on rabbinical education. It's the first volume to bring together rabbis, educators of rabbis, and also lay leaders who are often the objects of rabbinical education, but not invited into the conversation of rabbinical education. There are 31 essays and a companion Facebook page where new essays continue to be posted. The contributors span the denominational spectrum and also describe themselves as post and trans-denominational. The range in age of those who authored is from their 20s to their 90s, so it's truly from generation to generation, or in sociological terms, from the greatest generation to Gen X. And while the rabbis who contributed are primarily congregational rabbis, as Gary mentioned, there are those who serve in other venues as well, and our discussion tonight will take those into account. So how did I, a male boomer rabbi, come to co-edit a volume on rabbinical education with Ellie Rosher, a Protestant female millennial? Ellie had recently edited a book called Keeping the Faith in Seminary about the Protestant experience of some of her friends and students in theological school. And while she didn't know the meaning of the word bashert, I tracked her down and found out that she was moving back from New York to her hometown of Minneapolis, which has been my home since 1985. In working with her, I saw an opportunity for shared learning, and what I didn't realize is that I would also learn how we can see ourselves through the eyes of another. At one point, just to share a story or two of what that looks like, Ellie called me and said, "You know, I'm getting a lot of pushback on suggested editorial changes. That didn't happen with my book in working with Protestant students." A second story. Toward the end of the editorial process, Ellie called and said, "I've noticed, unlike my other set of essays, that there are a lot of words like ought and should and must, and a lot of prescriptive words that I just don't recall from the prior volume." And finally I said, "Ellie, welcome to the Jewish community." The stories about Ellie and several others remain with me today, and one of my impressions from the book is that we need less judgment and more openness, less certainty and more curiosity. I think Rabbi Harold Schulweis, one of the great rabbis from the last century, said it best when he wrote, "Most of the time, the rabbi may conduct him or herself like a Jewish priest. The rabbi wears vestments, officiates, conducts the ritual, and follows the codes, but the law is necessarily impersonal. The rabbi, like the judge, lives by the book. The law cannot make exceptions, but more often now, the rabbi confronts individuals with personal lives and unique situations which require more than following the law. And the rabbi experiences the loneliness of not knowing where and how to decide." The Pew study, released in October 2013 and recently updated, makes the case for a more collaborative community. If I can distill into a tweet my message, my takeaway as we begin, it's that we need each other more than ever before. That's 8 words and 40 characters. While rabbinical education is clearly an intensive personal experience of one rabbi at a time, it's also a communal investment and of incubating rabbis who will hopefully feel a stronger desire for shaping the Jewish future that awaits their leadership. And now I'd like to kick off this evening's panel with a question to our host, Rabbi Josh Davidson, to respond first to this scenario. A 22-year-old rabbinical student, potential rabbinical student, comes to you for advice and says, "Should I apply to rabbinical school?" What are the factors that you weigh in formulating a response, and would they be different if the person asking the question was 40 years old? Rabbi Davidson?
Well, my first response would be, I think that's wonderful that you're interested, that you feel called. When someone feels that calling, that needs to be celebrated and encouraged. But then I think I would start to ask questions about where their passions lie and what it is that truly animates that interest, and try to assess whether those passions would ultimately be satisfied in the rabbinate. The rabbinate is a varied profession, and so there are a lot of opportunities. But I'd want to have a sense as to whether their interests really lined up with service to the Jewish people. I'd also want to try to assess where they were in their own learning and whether I thought they were ready to apply to seminary or not. I've actually represented the Hebrew Union College in a number of settings where people have come to me with that question, and I've tried to advise them whether they were ready or whether they should perhaps take some graduate level classes to further their preparedness. With regard to age, I don't think it really matters. I still think that if someone's passionate about it, they have to be nurtured and encouraged. I think it's important to acknowledge that depending upon where you are in life and what your flexibility is in life, whether you can move or whether you need to remain in one place, that may impact what your professional opportunities are. It's only fair to let people know that. But I would do everything I could to be encouraging.
I think that my observation is that it's all about character. So I guess I'd want to explore that and understand, assuming this person is somebody that I don't know, I'd want to understand issues around motivation, I think, like Rabbi Davidson, but also about character and integrity, because at the end of the day, lots of things are going to happen in the course of a long career, and in almost all cases, how that career is shaped is going to be based on character.
Thank you. Two very polite figures.
I'll take it on. So I'm in a bit of a different position. I work at Yeshivat Maharat, the first Orthodox rabbinical school for women. So the challenge that I find is convincing more women to step up after a very long time of being told that they can't. So rarely do I have a conversation of discouragement. More often, our women need encouragement to own their own authority and step into the game.
Mm-hmm. I would repeat many of the points that were already made. From my own perspective, I think anybody who wants to come and study and learn, I would tend to be almost always encouraging, at least initially. The major question that I would ask them is, and I guess it's an echo of what Josh said, Rabbi Davidson said, is this the ultimate ground upon which you stand? If in fact that is your ultimate passion, and you see Judaism, Jewishness, whatever your understanding is of the demands that God might make of you as the ruling passions of your life, I think the rabbinate is an incomparable profession. I'd include the cantorate as well, and Jewish educational and other positions. I think the type of questions that Rabbi Levitt mentioned would certainly have to be explored before the person would ultimately step forward. I also think that in terms of age, people probably would consider, at least I'd bring up with them, issues of possible employment and directions in their life. But in the end, I would be encouraging of virtually anyone who desired to do this.
The question of moving to a rabbinical program, there were certain assumptions that were made. The ABA, the American Bar Association, approved its first hybrid law program this past year, meaning that there's a blend of online learning and also learning at periods together on campus. Is this a model that could be applied, an educational model that could be applied to rabbinical school?
Yeah. It's a model that we currently use at Yeshivat Maharat. We currently have about 10 students on site, 6 or more off site. Our students are currently living in Israel, London, Chicago, Boston, Baltimore. I must be missing 1 or 2, but so we're currently doing just that.
And how do you find that?
As a teacher, it's taken some time to get used to, but we have found that it has worked. Students who are engaged students are engaged on-site or off-site, and students who are less engaged on-site or off-site. So it seems that ultimately the deciding factor is the personality and the learning style of the student, and therefore we've had great success, I think, in doing just that.
And Rabbi Ellenson, you've had some experience in running rabbinical colleges and seminaries. What do you think about this model?
Optimally, I am actually opposed to it. Optimally, that is to say, if one lived in the best of all possible worlds, and I don't mean here to cite Candide and Voltaire, I actually am a great believer in what I would call elements of the informal or hidden curriculum. I think, and I know that Dr. Smolker would agree with this. In other words, I think some of the major learning often occurs in interstitial moments outside of the formal instruction in a class. We have realities in the world in which we live, and an institution like Yeshivat Maharat is dealing with it in an ideal sense. I still believe that the rabbinate is a profession optimally where you have a teacher and student, Rav v'Talmid or Talmidah, Rabbah v'Talmidah type of model that would apply. I've taught a great deal actually in classes online. Hebrew Union College, as many of you know, has a number of campuses, so we actually have electronic classrooms. It is infinitely better that we're able, sitting in Cincinnati, New York, Los Angeles, Jerusalem, I got them all, I only had 4, that we have professors on one campus who can offer instruction on others, and that students on the different campuses can get together that way. It is much, much better than if we did not have that opportunity to engage in that kind of education. In my own opinion as a teacher, and I have students here today who've been in classes like this, I do not think it's as effective as when I am literally in a classroom with students, and you have time to deal with them literally panim el panim, face to face, and you have time to talk with them after classes. So having said that, I don't want to appear to be overly technophobic or antediluvian, whatever the term might be that one would use. And I have no doubt that this is the direction in which the world is going. I mean, just one other point in that regard. I, for example, still prefer to have a book in my hand. I like a sefer. But I will tell you, I have a number of students. I was just saying to Erin a while ago that I did a doctoral seminar at NYU this semester. And one of the things I noted, it was on responsa literature. While I brought printed documents and Sfarim to every class, a number of the students only read off of the Bar Ilan Responsa Project. They are infinitely more comfortable. These are people in their 20s reading off of a screen than having the tactile aesthetic delight that I would receive from a sefer in front of me. And that's why when I read your book, I think, Hayim, that part of what you do is you push people like me to think about how education perhaps is or ought to take place. But at 67, it's not so easy for me sometimes. Actually.
I would just add that I think it's helpful to make the distinction between stuff known and time served. That there are times when what we want is our students to know stuff.
Right.
And when we want them to know stuff, let's just say, for example, my very favorite class in rabbinical school, biblical grammar. I think that
I'm sorry to hear that.
yeah. Oh,
I actually don't think it was her favorite class.
but we could talk about the hif-il a lot tonight if we want. The likelihood is that it's much better to learn that kind of stuff online in a one-to-one tutorial or even in some packaged form, because what we want to have happen there is to know biblical grammar. And the likelihood is that you're going to be in a class with 2 people who have learning disabilities, 4 people who are excellent in languages, a group of us in the middle, and we're going to sit there and wait. I mean, anyone who's gone to Hebrew school has watched this disaster occur. So I think there, I'm a big proponent of online learning when we want stuff known. Time served is a different issue, right? It sounds terrible, but it is really the way all of what David is referring to, which is the community that gets built and the kind of open source, magnificent stuff that happens in the hallways, in the elevators, in the bathrooms, in the cafeteria, wherever informal learning takes place.
So I think that we're hearing something of a transition, perhaps represented generationally, from the 5-year residential model to some sort of hybrid, to something that may be completely online. And as a part of this discussion of model and time served, Rabbi Levitt, you had said something earlier about character in rabbis. And I think that we need to address that issue for a moment. And who is responsible then, especially as we think of alternative educational options, who is responsible for putting more safeguards in place to prevent rabbis from engaging in unethical behavior? Is it the schools, rabbinical organizations? Can they be trusted to police their own members?
Look, I've sat on admissions committees for the Hebrew Union College, and I know the depth and seriousness of the conversations that take place around that table. And that committee does the best it can to assess whether people are right for the rabbinate. And the college, whatever seminary it might be, is the first gatekeeper. And it doesn't end when they're in. The faculty is obviously continuing to assess formally or informally. There are field work programs at our seminaries where student rabbis, cantors, educators are serving in communities, and there's supervision in that regard too. And then once students are ordained and are serving, then whatever the rabbinical body might be has a responsibility there as well. It's an extraordinarily challenging task. At some level, you have to, I think, trust each institution along the way, whether it's the seminary or the rabbinical body or the congregation or community where they're serving, to make assessments on a frequent enough basis as to whether the individual is right for the rabbinate or not.
Dr. Smolker?
Well, the Orthodox community is reeling from scandal, as some of you might know. So it's something that we are all very much thinking about. I would say that within our own institution, we speak all the time about boundaries, about policing our own boundaries, being clear about what our role is and what our role isn't. My particular contribution, well, among others, is I work with the pastoral curriculum, and so it's a integrated part of the curriculum that we spend a good deal of time on. We are graduating our 3rd year of graduates in just a few weeks, And so our numbers aren't vast. One of the problems we face is that we don't yet have a rabbinical organization that is overseeing us since we are so new. The International Rabbinical Fellowship, the IRF, will be accepting our students, hopefully, when they apply. But as I said, we're so new that the oversight isn't quite there. So yes, in that sense, we feel very much responsible for our alumni. We are in constant touch with them, and thankfully we haven't yet encountered any great.
Rosie's spiking and not yet.
We haven't yet encountered great ethical troubles, but it's very much on our radar.
I mean, I think the issue is that when you're talking about rabbinic education, and in a sense, I want to modify what I said at the outset. In other words, in theory, kol dichvin yetei v'yechul. I mean, anyone who wants to come and study and learn, of course, I would be initially anxious to let them do that. But on the other hand, as the conversation has evolved now, the issue is that to be a rabbi or a maharat is actually quite distinct from what it would be to be a scholar alone. In my own life, when I sat on doctoral admissions committees at places like UCLA in my previous life, the admissions standards or decisions were actually fairly easy. I mean, that is to say, you were training someone to be a scholar of Jewish history, Jewish thought. Do they have the requisite linguistic backgrounds? What did they score on their GRE in English, i.e., do they have the ability to read the kind of text in the humanities that one would be expected to read in this kind of area? Do they have good writing skills? It's mostly a kind of intellectual judgment, and the question of what they're going to do with this knowledge later, or the kind of models that they'll be, and you hope that they'll be good teachers and you can model that for them, but you don't ask remotely the questions you ask, I think, when you're admitting people to rabbinical school. I mean, if you look even at, I try to think about it in the way that the Sephardic tradition puts it. They have 3 titles for rabbis. One is that a rabbi has to be a marbitz Torah. I mean, you expect your rabbi to be knowledgeable Jewishly. If they're not knowledgeable Jewishly, then sort of what's the point? In other words, that's a kind of sine qua non. It's an essential, a necessary, but hardly a sufficient criterion. But then the rabbi has to be a chaver, a chaverah. That is to say, the way I understand that is that what it would mean to be a chaver is the person ultimately empathic. Do they have sympathy? Do they understand what it is that the needs are of the people whom they're going to serve? And if they don't have some kind of natural sense of empathy, then it's difficult to know what it would mean for them to be a rabbi, because these people are engaged not in Wissenschaft, that is to say, study for its own sake, but the question is, how do you apply all of this knowledge that you have, which is not a question you ask in a PhD program. And finally, you call a rabbi a chacham or chokhmah. That is to say, can they take all of this knowledge and apply it in I don't know, as my father would call it, tachas. I mean, do they have some degree of seichel when it comes to how they're going to operate in the world? I mean, and finally, the last quality, but hardly an insignificant one, for me at least. I remember as a little boy, and I'm sure everyone in this room knows this midrash. Why was Moses selected to be a rabbi and the shepherd of our people? Because God observed that Moses saw one little sheep that had escaped from the flock, and Moses went and put the sheep on his back and brought the sheep back. What should the rabbi do? The rabbi needs to have such a sense of empathy that what rabbis should engage in is zikui harabim. They need to take the text of the tradition, and how do they apply it in ways that grant merit to people? I mean, that should in the end be the ultimate task of the rabbi, and that's what it means to be a Ro'eh Yisrael. When I was first president of the College Institute, all of you remember that in 2001, 2, 3, terrible problems in Israel, bombings every day, and there was a big argument, debate on the Board of Governors of Hebrew Union. Should the absolute requirement that students go to Israel under these conditions be maintained? Should there be any exceptions that would be made for any students? And I'll be honest, the board voted, and I was a strong proponent of this, to say that someone who would not go to Israel, who wanted to serve as a rabbi among the Jewish people, even under those conditions, if they wouldn't be at one with the people Israel, they could do a lot of other things. They should not be rabbis, in my opinion. And these are all the different qualities that come into play. And that is why, if I were in the position of being the head of Yeshivat Maharat, and Baruch Hashem Yom Yom, I'm not there, and I wanted more women to lean in, I undoubtedly would take the position of Rabbah Horovitz and bring these wonderful women in from all of these communities. But the kind of things that I'm talking about optimally, I think can be formed better in community than they can be online, even as I know that the world is really moving in another direction.
So I just want to ask one question. This is a yes or no answer, and then move on to the subject of Israel. Should rabbis be required to have weekly supervision? Yes or no? And we'll just start with Rabbi Davidson and move down our panelists.
I'm not sure what that would look like. Yes, I suppose. I just don't know
Okay,
what
we're
it
going to
would look
move down the panel.
I mean, I have weekly supervisions. I meet with my president every week, absolutely.
What about therapeutic supervision?
Whoa.
Nothing implied, by the way. This is just the
No
issues of
implication taken.
empathy and not sliding over a
No,
boundary.
I mean, if you're requiring yes or no, I would say no. I would.
Thank you. Rabbi Ellenson?
I would answer both in the way that my colleagues did. Yes, no. As a Devar Ba'alma, it is impossible.
Oh, there he's going. How come you're letting him do it?
I'm not, because now we're going to go down to...
Yes.
Thank you. Now let's move on to the topic of Israel. There were 31 essays in this anthology, and the subject of Israel did not come up once in any sort of substantive way, other than in passing. What is the role of Israel in contemporary rabbinical education today? And Rabbi Ellenson, maybe...
Well, I think that Israel is a prerequisite for forming a sense of Jewish peoplehood for Jews. If one really believes in the notion of Jewish people, and you have the rebirth of our people as a nation state in the modern world, how someone could become a rabbi and not engage in a significant way and know Israel firsthand, regardless of how they come to function later in life. I would like to think that the reason the word doesn't appear more in there, the nature of the essays and the questions that people were specifically addressing, but having said that, I mean, it would be the reason why when our students go to Israel, I not only want them to have a year there in terms of their formation, but it's equally important to me that they spend time, let's say during Pesach, working in the former Soviet Union. I mean, we have projects of this type. I mean, I am a person who believes in the centrality of Jewish peoplehood. I mean, here are the writings of Shimon Ravidovich, the first head of the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies Department at Brandeis. Professor Ravidovich used the notion of an ellipsis to symbolize the nature of what it means to be a Jew, the notion of arivut, mutual responsibility that informs Jewish people. And with an ellipsis, there's neither beginning nor end. I mean, you have Yerushalayim, the land of Israel, and you have Bavel, the diaspora. And I would see both of these as being integral to the formation of the character of a rabbi.
Well, it's interesting because Jewish peoplehood also did not come up as a topic within the book. So, Rabbi Levitt, what does Jewish peoplehood mean today for those who are now fourth and fifth generation removed from the immigrant experience? And if you could also comment on the role of Israel in rabbinical education.
Well, I suspect you're not going to get any disagreement on this panel about what Rabbi Ellenson articulated. So stipulated that I think none of us, I'll speak for myself, I certainly don't think that that you can be a rabbi today without Ahavat Yisrael. That obviously takes on many different connotations. But here I think it's actually a leadership issue because truthfully, I think there are many certainly in the non-Orthodox Jewish community today who live very comfortably with Jewish identities that do not include the love of Israel. That we may lament that, but that is real. And if we see the role of rabbi as that of articulating the wishes of our community, then I suppose you could argue that Israel just doesn't have that central place, despite what Pew says. I think our experience is that lots of people would prefer to construct Jewish identities without Israel because it's just too complicated and troubling and painful, or sadly irrelevant. So here I think not only is it central for all the obvious reasons, but if not we taking that role, if not us, then we've abandoned a leadership role in American Jewish life on this issue. What I think is troubling is that increasingly rabbis find themselves in places where they find it hard to find their voice around issues in Israel. Increasingly, boards say to new rabbis, Rabbi, the pulpit is free for you. Feel free to talk about anything you like. Just please don't talk about Israel. And that's I think a real serious issue. On the issue of peoplehood, I think this is really, really challenging. Actually, more challenging than it was certainly when I was a rabbinical student. This was a kind of given, your loyalty to the Jewish people in all its diversity. And I sense that that's an increasingly hard conversation to have, for example, with my 5 children, who were raised, I think liberal parenting is raising your children to independently come to the same conclusions you have. And, sadly, they have not, right? So I hope, and maybe if push comes to shove, I would say I believe that they feel a loyalty to the Jewish people, but in all its manifestations. But I think it's a much harder concept for younger people, and maybe the younger people in the audience will have something to say about that.
Yeah, I think Israel education isn't just about identity building. It's about teaching moral courage, because rabbis do need to have the courage of their convictions when it comes to speaking about Israel. They also, though, need to have an understanding of where the people they're speaking to stand, and what it is that those people might need to hear that they don't already think about when it comes to Israel's security in the world. Peoplehood is something that probably varies in passion depending upon the nature of the community a rabbi's engaged with, whether it's a liberal community or a more traditional Jewish community. Within the liberal Jewish world, we have an emphasis on universalism, and oftentimes the challenge is to try to help our people understand that without particularism, without a commitment to our Jewish history and Jewish identity, universalism, our universalist commitments stand on pretty shaky ground, that we learn about our responsibility to the wider world through our own Jewish experiences.
So I think we're going to make this the last panel question before we hear your questions. Please complete the following statement. A 21st century rabbi today is uniquely suited to...
I think a 21st century rabbi has to be able to make Judaism relevant and to recognize that we live in what I might call a post-assimilationist Jewish world, where people are coming to us often with an inkling, an interest, but not much else. And we have to meet them where they are and tap into whatever excitement or pride they may feel, and create as many doorways into synagogue life or communal life as we possibly can.
Thank you. Relevance. Rabbi Levitt?
I would say that a 21st century rabbi is uniquely suited to access the Jewish past in ways that were never true before the internet and translation, is uniquely capable of living in the present, thanks in part to our connections to Eastern traditions that have enabled us to find that power of the present, and really committed to a very uncertain future.
Thank you. Rabbi Ellenson?
I suppose a 21st century rabbi should uniquely be suited to have the traditions speak in a contemporary cadence that will help people in their quest for meaning in the world.
Thank you. Dr. Smolker?
I've heard it said that rabbis today can no longer assume Jews in their pews. So I think a 21st century rabbi is an entrepreneur, is one who is willing to actually seek out the Jews where they are, to not make assumptions that they're necessarily within their buildings, but to go help them make meaning in the places that they're willing to be.
Thank you. And I think that we are ready now for questions from the audience. And the question is how to get to that recruitment pipeline for rabbinical school.
Well, I think we've got to not lose them when they graduate high school, because all of us who've served in synagogues and led youth programs identify these terrific students. They go off to college and they get excited by all kinds of other things, and they may not have a rabbi or a Jewish mentor on campus who is going to keep them along a track where service to the Jewish people might be what they choose.
I would like to pick up on what Erin said, because I think it's really critical, and we haven't addressed so much the way in which rabbinical schools need to change the way in which they're educating rabbis in order to be attractive to young people, right? I think anybody in high school or college right now that's paying a lot of attention knows that we're living in really disruptive times. The Jews are really not in the pews, and yet we're continuing to train them in many ways as though they were. So I think we start first, at least to the extent that we've got control over this, about thinking about where those Jews are and what those skills need to be, and making that really exciting, right? We don't tend to think about rabbis as entrepreneurs, and yet they're going to have to be. And if they're going to have to be, there's a certain difference in training, which does not mean that you're not still studying Talmud, not at all. But it is fascinating to me that there are so many Jews concentrated on so few college campuses, and we have not put spiritual leadership at the front of the line in our rabbinical schools. We don't train people for them. We don't encourage people. We certainly don't pay them. Like, if we want to talk about the elephant in the room, right? If you want to be successful in the rabbinate, right? If success is defined by salary, so I think a lot of the onus is actually on the leadership, not just of rabbinical schools, but but broadly in the community to create so much attractiveness there that the pipeline's there.
See, we have another.
Can I just say?
Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Smolker?
Sorry. When I was younger, I had a rabbinic figure. When I was a kid, I had a rabbi.
Say that on
Right.
this panel.
I'm a lot
Sorry.
I'm a lot older than you might think I am.
Thank you.
In any case, when I was a kid, growing up in an Orthodox community, I was told by my rabbi that if I were a boy, I would make a very good rabbi. So part of creating the pipeline in my community is modeling for all the young girls out there what the possibilities are before them. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you. So the question is that rabbinical schools are still primarily geared toward producing students who become congregational rabbis. Do we need to expand and perhaps vastly change some of those educational options?
So here I think, I'd actually point to two of the essays in your book, and there could be many more that one would look to. One, and one of the authors is here tonight, Rabbi Jeffrey Brown, talks about the fact that 10 years ago, when he was a rabbinical student, relative to today, very, very little education, for example, in relationship to issues of intermarriage, relative to what we have today. If one reads Rabbi Brown's essay, the curriculum has really been shifted radically over the past decade in light of the demographic realities, particularly in the non-Orthodox world, the realities that you have 50, 60, 70%, maybe even 80% intermarriage rates. There have been really very significant programs developed that educate the students really quite directly in areas of outreach, working with intermarriage, that raise the kind of questions that you ultimately had to come about and face in your own rabbinate in relationship to the performance of intermarriage. How does one create an inclusive community? The Institute for Jewish Spirituality has an initiative now at the Hebrew Union College where that has come to be an integral part of the curriculum, talking about the internal the internal spiritual life in a way that quite simply wasn't true, certainly when I was in rabbinical school 40 plus years ago. When I think about all of this, and I guess, Josh, in responding to your question, one thing that I'd just be a little wary of, and this is my own personal opinion, is educating one for relevance. That is to say, one really never knows what knowledge it is that one acquires that can be applied at a later point. That is to say that sometimes learning, like fog, so to speak, creeps in on cat's feet. I didn't actually invent that metaphor. I mean, that is to say, it becomes difficult to know precisely what it is you learn at one moment that can be applied at another moment. That doesn't mean, and I know the RRC and other schools have at times focused very, very specifically on educating people for particular roles, but in the end, I think there has to be attention paid to it, but I will be honest with you. What quite frankly bothers me is the following. And here I do think the Orthodox world is in a radically, radically different position than virtually all the non-Orthodox seminaries. When I have taught or lectured in Orthodox rabbinical schools, including Yeshiva University at different times, almost all the rabbinic students I teach minimally have 12 years of day school, usually a year or two at a yeshiva in Israel, 4 years at a place like Yeshiva College or Stern. When those people enter rabbinical school, quite frankly, they do not have the same kind of challenges. I'll just speak for myself, that Hebrew Union College has. And I think this would be true of the other liberal seminaries. And it goes back to a point that Rabbi Levitt made earlier about knowledge. Part of what occurs at institutions like HUC, and I could really include all the non-Orthodox seminaries in this, is simply data has to be acquired. What is the Matbeah Shel Tefillah? How is it that a Jewish prayer service looks? What does it mean to read a Daf Gemara? What does it mean to have a sense of Jewish history, Jewish text? A great deal of time actually needs to be spent on data, and some of the data, not all of it, some of the data, and obviously when you're teaching people in their 20s and 30s, they have infinitely greater sophistication, but quite frankly, some of the data could have been picked up at 6, 7, and 8 years of age just simply by rote repetition. And that is one of the great challenges that we have in non-Orthodox rabbinical schools. So that one of the problems then that ultimately emerges is, how do you both teach for knowledge that people need as a sine qua non, and at the same time prepare them for these questions of relevance? And that's why I want to go to one other essay, the one written by Rabbi Michael Marmer. Rabbi Marmer talks about a Tana, a rabbinic authority of the first 2 centuries, who, after completing yeshiva, in his first pulpit, as it were, was asked to stand lifnei teva. He was supposed to lead the Amidah and lead in the Shema. Simple davening skill. And the rabbi did not know how to do it. He knew how to paskin, he knew how to issue Jewish legal opinions. He didn't know simply how to lead a religious service. He had never learned that in the yeshiva. Part of what I take from that story, and I think Rabbi Marmer, who's the provost of Hebrew Union, part of the point he wants to make is, you can never teach anybody enough. What is it that happened in this case? Rabbi Eliezer goes back, he confronts his teachers, says, I'm really embarrassed. He said, I'm seen as being completely inauthentic by the people whom I am supposed to serve as a rabbi. Why is it I'm inauthentic? I can't do the simplest, I can't perform the simplest liturgical skill. So of course he then goes back and he learns it, and then he goes back and ultimately serves as a great rabbi. I think part of the point that Rabbi Marmer wants to make in that essay, and you could certainly comment on it, Hayim, as the editor of the volume, is no matter how much you attempt to educate people for any kind of area, you will never educate them enough. And I suppose one of the things that needs to be considered is that when you have people for 4, 5, and 6 years, how is it you also prepare them to have the humility and the sensitivity to know that their education has to continue? It just has to continue. If you think that a rabbinical school, and I dare say medical schools, law schools, other professional schools have the same challenge, you simply are going to, by definition, virtually fail. What you hope is that you give people the Kanei Midah, the tools that they can use, I suppose, for a lifetime of acquisition and learning and a sensitivity to what they do not know and what they also then have to have. The last point here would be that, Rabbi Herring, you certainly have been in the lead of people throughout the 20th and 21st century who've devised programs for, I'd say, post-rabbinical school education, precisely because you've come to understand what those needs are.
Well, thank you. In partnership with others, just a quick note, and that is that rabbinical organizations strongly encourage rabbis for continuing education, but to the best of my knowledge, continuing education is not a requirement. Let's move on to the next question. So the question is, do we try and make it easier, given the reality of a proliferation of programs, to give students across the board greater access to one another's programs?
I mean,
Yes.
you answered your own question in a sense, right? We've got, at the moment, way too much real estate, way too many faculty members, and way too few students. And I think that's in part because we're living in a very disruptive time, and we just don't know right now what's going to be. I come from a real estate family. You never sell real estate, so I'm not recommending that. But I do think that, and implicit in your question is denominationalism really relevant? And I think we kind of know it isn't. And that many of our students come in, and it's easier for me to say this because I run a JCC, but many students come in and they may want the intensity of Orthodox learning, the social justice component which is notable in the reform movement, they don't necessarily come in with a mindset about denominationalism, and they'd prefer, and maybe it's better, for them to learn in a pluralistic environment in which they actually have to learn from one another and listen to one another. So I think and I would just end by saying that the minute rabbinical schools see the diminishing numbers of applicants, that ought to be a wake-up call that something's wrong. It ought not to be a moment to lower standards, to change the way in which we're thinking about this. It's like, gee, maybe we've got to be doing this differently.
I think we have another question or two.
Or 3 or 4 or 5.
So two sides of the same coin in this question, and that is the partnership between rabbis and lay leaders. What can be done to strengthen both sides of that equation?
Can I take that?
Please.
Start with that? Because I'm still stuck on the question about weekly supervision.
Well, I did change it to ongoing.
Okay. Because when I think about my role as the senior rabbi of this congregation, I also have weekly meetings with the president of my congregation, as you do. But I don't think about it so much as supervision. I think about it as partnership. And this is something that I think is less intuitive to seminary students who haven't grown up in congregational life or in organizational life the way some of us did. And the college, the seminary, wherever it might be, needs to help its students understand that lay people truly want to be their partners, and that anybody in congregational life knows that you can't accomplish anything unless you have good lay leaders around you who make it go. So that's a very important lesson that we need to teach. And frankly, it's not only about our relationship with lay leaders. It's about our relationship with all of the people we work with on a day-to-day basis. So, I meet weekly with my associates, my colleagues. I don't think about them so much as supervision. I think about it as how do we do this together? But just as my rabbinic colleagues are my partners, my lay leaders are my partners. And that's not intuitive. It is something that needs to be taught.
Thank you. I see we have a few more questions. What do we do to get more rabbis back on campus?
So I can speak with two hats. One is my Yeshivat Maharat hat, and the other is I happen to be married to somebody who addresses this question head on, Rabbi Dan Smolker, who works for Hillel. And I think that I happen to know there's quite a bit going on in the pipeline there to pay rabbis more, to make the jobs more appealing, to envision models that go beyond the campus themselves, because there are plenty of students who don't live on campus or who graduate from campuses, live in the neighborhood, but need a Jewish life. Chabad, interestingly, has given ideas.
Yeah.
We have a lot to learn from those who have really pioneered very successful models for how to invite Jewish students into homes, and look out for great things to come from Hillel, which will be modeling itself on some of those successful predecessors. That's fair.
Are we going to sacrifice learning of sacred texts at the expense of trying to catch up sociologically based on some trends of Pew?
I don't see it, actually. I think students are craving that learning, and I still see it pretty deep in the curriculum. So I don't think that there is a lack of desire to study those texts. And in fact, I think Boston Hebrew College, in many ways, is a leader in rabbinic education these days, getting lots of students getting some students and very, very committed to study of text.
I think it's where we get our greatest ideas.
Yeah.
There's this terrific text. It's Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg commenting on Genesis 26. It's the story of Isaac redigging Abraham's wells, and Abraham names all of the wells with God in the name. And Mecklenburg says he did it so that he could get people to come get a necessity, water. And they would come and they would pull the water and they'd say, "Come, let us draw water from the well of the living God." So we have to be innovative. We've got to figure out what people need out there in the world. But synagogues, Jewish communities, Hillels, what have you, can do it, can think more broadly about what it is that we're offering in an entrepreneurial way. And in doing that, we can actually draw people in to the Jewish community. I think the answers lie in those texts if we read them creatively.
And I think that sounds like a wonderful place to put a semicolon on the conversation, which will continue, I'm sure, in the days ahead. And a thank you to our hosts of the Jewish Week in Temple Emanu-El, the Skirball Center, and to my friends and colleagues. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.